Welcome to Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. We're really thrilled you've joined us. I have a special guest today, Greg Spencer, Westmont College, a good friend for years. I called him Dr. Spencer, and then when I graduated, I discovered he had a first name, Greg. Still hard for me to call him Greg, but Dr. Spencer, welcome.
Welcome to you. I'm just glad to be here, and I don't know, maybe depending on what you say, I might have you call me Dr. Spencer again.
Right,
We'll see
that's
how it
an
goes.
option. Dr. Spencer has been at Westmont for 30 years, 32?
32.
32 years as a professor of communication studies. He's been married for 40 plus years, and we'll get to his family in a minute. When you were my college professor, when did it hit you that I was special?
Seconds,
Seconds,
yeah. It could have been when I saw you at Candlestick Park and you were dressed up in a Dodger uniform. That time that my friend said, do not wear Dodger blue to Candlestick, you will get in a fight. And then I look up at the seventh inning and there's some crazy man running around yelling and screaming, and I think, I know that person.
Right.
It's Dean Wilson.
There it was.
There
And
it was.
as you know, so I wasn't a great student. I did not really frequent the library per se. My soon-to-be wife one time told me that she wanted to pull an all-nighter, which I said, now we're talking, you know. Turns out that was a term for studying all night for finals.
Who knew?
Which I wasn't familiar with, so I politely declined. But I digress. Let's talk Dodgers.
Right.
We share a love for the Dodgers. When did you fall in love with the Dodgers?
I cannot remember a summer without Vin Scully. So my dad always had the radio on. My brother and I have already decided that when Vin Scully dies, we'll be in mourning and weep bitterly for weeks. Yes. It's already tough with him retired. But I was a Dodger fan really in some pretty glory years in the early 60s with Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale and Maury Wells and great stuff.
Do you have a favorite player?
Oh, it would be
that hard to do?
Koufax. Yeah,
Koufax.
it would be Koufax.
Okay, good. That leads me to my next question.
Right.
Do you know Sandy Koufax's career ERA?
I know I should. I'm guessing 2.5.
2.76.
Not bad.
Not bad.
Yeah.
165 and 87 lifetime. Clayton Kershaw 2.44, 169 and 74. Now we've had this debate on Facebook a little bit. If they had protected Koufax's arm like they protect current pitchers, might his career have extended? So it's pretty hard to compare the two.
Right.
But we have them both.
Right.
That's the good news.
Yeah, exactly.
And I hope this
We'll
is the
take 'em.
year. I
Yeah.
hope this is the year. Husband of 40 years to Janet and father of 3 married daughters.
Right.
And grandfather of 4, now 6.
6 as of last Sunday.
As of last Sunday.
Right, yeah. So 5 grandsons, and we're excited. We're thrilled. It's as great a stage of life as everybody says.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Tell us about Dominic LaRusso. You used to mention him in class a lot.
Right.
And one of your mentors, maybe the mentor, or most significant mentor for you. Tell us about his impact and specifically what he taught you and how he influenced you.
Well, so many ways. When I first went to grad school, it was Dr. LaRusso, and he was as intimidating a person as you could imagine. So he was one of the professors that reviewed my sort of entrance exam that we had to do. And he said about my test that it was interesting and I'm being kind. So I pretty much just melted off the chair onto the floor. So it was a pretty tough beginning, but I ended up taking whatever he taught. It didn't matter. I took this series on theories of rhetoric that was just a transformative class for me and for most of the students in there, and it's a model for me for how to teach. So he was fantastic at teaching through questions and trying to get students to come up with what they could in the moment, great at keeping people engaged in the classroom, and he really was a kind of father figure to me. So he came down, visited me here, spoke at Westmont, Great time. Yeah.
Wow. You've written a book. This is your fourth?
This is my fifth book.
Fifth
Yeah,
book.
right.
Okay. It's
But who's counting?
But who's counting?
Right.
It's Reframing the Soul, how words transform our faith. I commend it to you, and we're going to have some copies actually available. So if you go to goodlifetelevision.org, or you can get it on Amazon, but we've just picked it up in the last few days, both my wife and I, and we're really excited about the stories are tremendous. You start in this book talking about your parents. Right. And so I wonder if you could take us kind of into your family home and start where kind of the book starts in terms of that.
Yeah. So my family was, typical, I guess, of 50s and early 60s, and I was not raised in a church home, church background. And where I begin the book is with, probably when I'm about 11 or 12, and I realized that my parents are drinking to drunkenness every night. So they had obviously consumed alcohol before then, but about my 6th grade year, it was every night, and it was for 15 years. So 15 years, every night to drunkenness, and my mom then got cirrhosis, was told she would die if she had one more drink, and she kept drinking. 6 months later, they said, "We really mean it." And then she stopped and slowly died of cirrhosis over 8 years. My dad became sober then too, and my mother died my first month teaching at Westmont. So that's a major part of my life, certainly of growing up, and it's the story that I begin with because at that time, and for many, many years, for decades really, when I thought about those experiences with my parents and what it was like, the way I talked about it was that my mom and dad had abandoned me. They abandoned me through their drinking. And they had some good qualities, but I really downplayed those and focused on the abandonment. And that was my frame. Mm-hmm. And partly what got me going with this book is recognizing that over the years, I think I did it earlier than my wife does, but I finally got around to seeing them as broken people who needed healing just like I do. And that last phrase is real important. So that took a long time to get me there, just to see them as human beings who had issues. My dad was in the war. I didn't even know until near the end of his life that he was at Iwo Jima. He was on a destroyer. I asked him, "So, Dad, what was your job there? I didn't even know you were there. You never have told me about this."
Wow.
And he said, "Well, my job was to fish dead bodies out of the water."
Oh, my goodness.
So he came back, and not surprisingly, like many in his generation, he started drinking. There was Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. and the Rat Pack. This is what we did. When you walked in the door, your wife gave you a drink. And I think my mom, who grew up very poor, was a pretty insecure person. I think she drank to cover that. So it took me a long time to begin to see them as just people who had issues and drank for reasons and had difficulty coping. Doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me add to that first frame. I didn't leave that first frame. They did abandon us kids, but they also were broken people who needed healing. And one of the great things about that is I think it helped me have a relationship with my father, which was really terrible most of my life. And the last 10 years of his life, from his age 85 to 95, those were our best years as father and son. Wow. And by the end, I was calling him every night, and it was a very important relationship. Wow. But I had to forgive him. Yeah. And that took me a long time.
And so is that experience kind of what started to spur the idea of how do we frame things, or how do we reframe things?
Yeah, what's the beginning? It's hard to know. I teach communication, so the idea of framing and reframing is really at the heart of the discipline, that our words matter and that we kind of frame the world with language, and then we step into that frame and live in that frame. So we'll get to more of that later, but I think that this event in my life really helped me see the power of reframing.
Yeah.
Because I experienced it, and we all have,
Right.
on one level or another.
You talk about framing well and not just happily.
Right.
And you say this isn't spin or propaganda, and that reframing our lives and stories well is crucial and honest and potentially transformative. Talk about the difference between framing or reframing and then that transformational power, I guess, versus kind of happy talk.
Right. When I first start talking about this with people, they often say, "Oh, it's just positive thinking," and there is something positive about a lot of our reframing. But I think it's important that we frame our lives truthfully. And sometimes we live in what Frederick Buechner would call a tragic truth. So to lie about that tragic truth doesn't mean that we're framing well.
One way we're lying.
It's lying. Yeah, one way I put it in the book is that we're not supposed to frame things as if we were on the sunny side of the street if there's a hurricane on both sides of the street. I mean, you have to name the hurricane. Now, there are different ways to walk through that with language, because no matter what event we experience, there are thousands of ways to talk about that event. And so we can take a tragic event and talk about it only in absolutely the bleakest terms that are imaginable. But there are other ways that are still truthful that we can speak into and then live into.
Right. So it's truth telling. I mean, along the way, it's not denial.
Right. That's the plan.
That's the plan.
Right.
This program is called Good Life. I told you before we started taping that you talk about the good life. On this program, we're dwelling on goodness and service and love and so forth. And as I said to you before, we want to keep it real, and that's not an absence of suffering or that the sun's always shining. So we talk about suffering and difficulty, but we try to dwell on the good. You talk about the good life and how people frame what that is. And you talk about the endless party or the everlasting party. I'm entitled to the good life, trying to find it in technology or control, and then kind of a peace on earth vision, and how all these fall short. Talk about that, and how can we pursue a good life while not denying the realities of a broken world?
That's a very large question. So we'll see how we go here. The phrase, the good life, like many other phrases, I would argue has been co-opted by our culture. I think the question, what is the good life, is the most important question there is. How you answer that question is everything. But the culture has co-opted that phrase that it means being rich and being famous and spending a lot of money and having a lot of parties, and it's just such a small way to think about what the good life is. So among other things, the book is aiming to help us answer that question in more meaningful ways. So how do we define good? And then what's the life that we can live into in those terms, what we say is good? So does the good life, I think there's lots of things that we could say are part of the good life, but I think great conversation is among the highest goods that we can experience as human beings. There's lots of great things we can experience, but having a great conversation.
Right. Imagine that, talking to one another.
Imagine that, yeah. Right. Put down your phone.
It's kind of old-fashioned.
Yeah. So that's not in our culture's view of what the good life is, but it's real important that we ask that question and figure out what that means.
Yeah. You talk about reframing being especially relevant, and you call these the 4 essentials of the soul. And maybe we could just kind of go through them one at a time, if that's all right, in terms of remembering the past, anticipating the future, dwelling within ourselves, and then engaging others. Right. So let's start with remembering the past. Talk about reframing and I guess in part how that can help us heal.
Yeah, let me just step back a little bit farther behind that, if that's okay. I mean, I'd also like to talk a little bit about words and order, but I can get to that. But the 4 essentials, just to get us talking about that, we often hear that we live at the intersection of time and space. And that sounds complicated, sounds philosophical, but it really isn't. I mean, that's where we live. We live somewhere between the past and the future. That's the present. And we live somewhere between sort of the inner world and the outer world in terms of our lives in space. Here we are in this space. So what I've done with this way of thinking is that if we can figure out how we talk about the past and the future, how we dwell within ourselves and how we relate to others, we've really captured a lot of life. Yeah. So I call those soul essentials that all of us deal with, all of us frame in a variety of ways, and sometimes we do that pretty destructively and sometimes we do it well, and all of us experience things in life where we realize, oh my gosh, the frame that I had, the way that I've explained this event doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. So, for example, one of the stories in the book comes from a student who happily married, she had a 2-year-old, was pregnant with their next child, and she gets called. Her husband has pulled off the side of a road in a busy street in Texas and is assisting someone on the side of the road. Some teenager comes over the hill, kills him, and somebody else who'd stopped. I mean, her life is just absolutely upside down. And so the way that she had framed her life, partly, hey, I'm a good person, I'm following God, Jesus should help me in all my circumstances, well, that blew up. Yeah. And she worked through that in a way where she maintained her faith, but that was difficult. I mean, the kind of maybe saccharine view that she had before just didn't cut it in the face of a serious tragedy. So she had to figure out what was a deeper way to walk through that. Yeah. So that's kind of the big picture with these soul essentials.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and start with words, and,
okay.
and then we can go forward with the 4 areas.
All right. So one way to think about framing and reframing is that words help us with our sense of order. So, we're trying to negotiate our way through life and get through the day and have a good experience, have a good life. We use words to create our sense of order. What's today like? It's a good day, it's a bad day. How's my marriage going? How do I explain my work-a-day world? So words relate to the way we order things. So years ago, I read a book by Oliver Sacks, the famous neurologist. Title is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. That's a great case study. But the book is about various cases that he had, patients that came to him with various crazy things that were wrong with them. So this woman goes in for surgery and gets a shot of some kind that's very normal and predictable. But she has a highly, highly unusual reaction to this shot. She loses her proprioception. So proprioception is our body's sense of itself. It's how you know right now where your left calf is. You don't really feel your left calf, you don't feel your cheek, but you know where it is. So our body has a sense of order. So what happened to Christina is that her body was still okay everywhere, but she couldn't control it because she couldn't know where it was. So if she looked at her hand, she could control her hand, but otherwise it just wandered. She had no proprioception. So I was so taken by this idea that our body has a sense of order. And then I was thinking, that's what words do for us. Words create another kind of order for our lives. So you might say that we have a kind of rhetorical proprioception, which is how language gives us order for where we are. Where are we in the world? Who are we? And we might be going along and all that's working fine, and then, like I said, something happens, and then those words no longer provide the sense of order that they once did, and then we think, oh, I've got to reframe. I have to think of new ways to describe my experience. So that's one way that we kind of get into reframing. I think we also sometimes recognize through conversation or maybe teaching or preaching or something, we think, the way I've been thinking about the world, the way I've been framing it, there's a lot of problems with that. And so nothing really dramatic happens, no accident, no retirement, no divorce, but we realize, no, actually, I think I'm being called to reframe. I'm being called to reframe. So you might, take a verse out of the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus says, it's not just about murder, it's about anger. Anger is related to murder, and if you just think, you haven't murdered, you're not really safe here. You need to think about what's deeper and the way in which you're angry. And you might read that and think, I really need to start talking and acting differently because I need to face my anger. So circumstances might lead us to reframe, but also we might just kind of recognize it in the course of life or through a teaching that we might need to reframe.
Yeah, so the power of words in framing our lives. I mean, so it would seem to me that Scripture and meditating on the Scriptures and memorizing the Scriptures as part of the words that we know and use would be a powerful part of somebody's life if they're following Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, why would you read the Scripture at all? I mean, in a way, you're reading it to say, how does this inform my life? What way might I need to reorient my behavior, but also my words that might lead us into new ways of acting and believing.
Thinking and talking.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So let's go back to the 4 essentials.
Great.
Let's start with remembering the past.
Yeah.
And you mentioned your story with your parents, and I want to talk a little bit more about your dad, especially at the end here. But in terms of reframing the past or how you view the past, you mentioned remembering the past with gratitude.
Right.
I believe gratitude is just huge, huge, and I've learned that in times in painful ways, but how important gratitude is. But talk about how, in terms of the first essential here, how remembering the past with gratitude and reframing can help us in our lives in general, but also help with healing.
Right.
And in your case, it sounds to me like it played a big part in changing all of your relationships
Right.
with your parents.
Yeah.
But talk about that.
Yeah. So if we were to think of every word we use as a frame, I like to think of it as a window, like a frame around a window. So every word I use helps me see the world. So if I say, let's just talk about what's going on. Oh, these are terrible times. These are terrible, awful times. Or these are amazing, these are fantastic times. Well, I'm looking at the world through that window that the Word has provided for me. So each frame is built upon what I call in the book a framework. So I'll get to this with remembering, okay? Yeah. So what I do is associate a virtue with each of these soul essentials. So I think we ought to strive to remember the past with gratitude. We want to anticipate the future with hope. We want to dwell within ourselves with peace. We want to engage with others in love. So each of these soul essentials, each of these virtues is constructed on a framework that I view as a kind of continuum. So in the past, we are working with some place along the line from bitterness to forgiveness. And we can think of our memories someplace falling somewhere on that line. And the more we lean toward forgiveness, the more grateful we're going to be. So some of that just takes work of self-assessment. I mean, maybe therapy, maybe confrontation. That how am I viewing these important events in my past? So I was recognizing that I was viewing the alcoholism of my parents primarily through bitterness. And I was looking for more evidence. I was always on the lookout. Maybe my brother could tell me a story of how horrific it was, and he did. He remembered things I didn't. I mean, he was a little bit older. He said, yeah, do you remember that time that, we were on vacation and Mom and Dad just pulled over on the side of the road in this strange town and left us in the car and went into a bar for 2 hours? I don't remember that. But it's terrible, and there's more evidence for how awful.
Add it to the list.
They are. Add it to the list.
Right.
I was reading this book about the Cultural Revolution in China, just light reading before going to bed, various bloodbaths that Mao was engaged in. But here's something that's fascinating. So Mao instituted bitterness campaigns. That's what they were called, bitterness campaigns. So he would bring people to make up stories about the bourgeois past and get people to realize that things were terrible, to increase their bitterness. And as awful as that sounds for Chinese people dealing with that, I think that's a lot of what we do. We engage in campaigns of bitterness that my life's terrible, and let me give you the evidence, and I'm going to supply that more and more and more. So the sooner we recognize that the way I'm remembering the past is really with bitterness, then I can begin to think of alternative ways to talk about that, and we hope move toward forgiveness and more gratefulness. And I don't want to make it sound like it's simple. Like, oh, you just recall a memory and then, oh, let's use a different word for it, and now everything's fine. I think it's much deeper and more difficult than that, but it is recognizing that we step into the frame of the words we use. So if my parents are terrible, horrible, awful, no good, very bad parents, then that's the frame I'm going to live in, and that's
not going to be good for you.
It's going to affect me. My parents are gone. Doesn't affect them.
Right.
I'm not making them pay the price for what they did by me becoming increasingly bitter.
Right, and we all, in a broken world, we all have plenty of material for those lists if we're going to keep the lists. Dallas Willard said forgiveness is like oxygen. I always think about that, and of course the enemy wants us on that side of the continuum, so that's really interesting.
I don't remember the exact line. Lewis Smedes said something like, forgiveness is, remembering the offender. When you can get to the place where you can remember the offender and wish them well. And I really like that because I can kind of get my hands around that. So I know when I can wish them well, and I know when in my heart of hearts I don't.
You know what I do? My little test is, if I saw their name pop up on my cell phone calling me, what would I do? And what happens inside? That's my little test.
So when your name pops
for your
up,
next
it's
book.
Balloons, it's stars,
unicorns.
it's fireworks, it's fantastic.
Right. This has to be pretty special for you just sitting
It's
here.
really pretty amazing. But I had to do some reframing before I came. Okay, so just tell you I'm working on it.
We're going to get to humility later.
Yeah, right.
Anticipating the future. And in a minute I want to get really into hope. But talking about reframing and having hope for the future. Talk about that for a moment.
I think part of anticipating is recognizing that the way Jesus put it is, in this world you will have trouble, but take courage, I've overcome the world. I think a lot of the problem that we have with thinking about the future is that we think that we have to be positive in the sense that we can't recognize that the world is a troubled, difficult place. So by Jesus saying, in this world you have trouble, it gives me the freedom to say, yeah, Yeah, I do. And it is a troubled place. So we can face into that. Scott Peck, in his book, The Road Less Traveled, first 3 words in his book are, life is difficult. Then the next sentence is, most of the struggle that we have in life is not believing those 3 words. So I like that. Let's begin. The world has fallen. It's difficult. We experience tragedy. But take heart. Take heart. I've overcome the world. So one of the ways I think about this in terms of our framing is to encourage us to have low expectations but high hopes. It's a paradox that you have to work on. But so if I have high expectations, which I often do, so I'm a perfectionist and expect everything to go well. If anything gets in my way, I'm a mess. If I'm full of high expectations. If my shoelace breaks, it's a tragedy because I needed my shoelace to work to get to my next appointment to do what I needed to do.
Right. Check off your list. I read about your list.
Right. Lots of lists. Lots of lists. So, but if I can have low expectations, I don't really expect life to go perfectly or wonderfully, but I hope, I believe that things might get better. And I believe that all the time.
And that helps to not be cynical.
Right, right. So if I only had low expectations, I might be cynical. But I think if you had a kind of a twisted view of hope, you would think that means everything's going to be fine. Everything's always going to be fine. That's what hope means. But I think hope is the anticipation of transformation. So do I believe that? Do I believe that things could get better? Things could transform? It's not entirely true of my tennis game anymore, right? I might be on the downward side of that.
Right.
But about the important things in life, just that's what hope means, I think, is to anticipate transformation.
Dallas Willard defined hope as the joyous anticipation of good. Pretty spot on.
Yeah, he steals things from me all the time.
Right.
It really drives me crazy.
I can imagine the
especially
frustration.
doing it before I was born and stuff like that.
The joyous anticipation of good that is not yet here or is unseen. On page 131, you say hope is the confidence that God has done something that empowers us to wonder, to work, and to wait. I liked that. I think I like your and Dallas Willard's equally.
Great. Oh, wow.
So,
I'll take that.
For what it's worth.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned Jesus, in this world you'll have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. This hope let's just sit on hope for a second. Yeah. So I've done some work in Dallas and a little bit here, but in inner city kind of devastated places. And I think in the ghetto or inner city areas where it's like a desert. And I think one of the biggest things that I noticed was a profound lack of hope because there was nothing to look forward to. Yeah. And there's a generational cycle of despair, poverty, desperation, addiction, and so there's nothing to look forward to. Yeah. And I was trying to imagine for myself, what would it look like if my life had nothing to look forward to? Yeah. It's pretty terrible. Right. We'd plan a holiday party down there, and we'd announce it 4 months in advance, because it really wasn't about the party. Yeah. It was about the expectation.
Yeah, exactly.
It was about what am I going to wear?
Right. And
what are we going to do? And it was every day. These kids especially would think about it. So I realized it wasn't just about that night. Now we just changed 4 months of the year if we announced the party here. Right. And so because it was about that anticipation. But obviously people need hope, and I just think that that idea of looking forward, expecting the good, while being feet on the ground, because I have 5 kids and we don't want to send kids out of the world thinking that everything is going to pretty much be okay, because it's pretty tough out there. Right. And at the same time, we don't want to send out cynical kids who aren't believing for the best and believing God and going for it. So there's kind of that, I don't know if it's a tension, but it's both.
I think it is a tension. It's I like the way G.K. Chesterton talks about virtue. He says it's not exactly a tension, and he doesn't like the word balance. I think I've been so influenced by Chesterton that I almost never use the word balance. I don't like the idea of living the good life is somehow, don't do this and don't do that. So Chesterton sees life as an adventure. So it means often taking two things and running with them full blast. So in this circumstance, I think it means taking, in this world you will have trouble, and take heart, I have overcome the world. It's both of them full blast and not denying one or the other.
Yeah. And if in this world we will have trouble, that could include your spouse might not be perfect, but that's not cause for divorce.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that publicly because that could come back to haunt me.
Right. We are on camera.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
We'll just keep that between the two
All
of us.
right, okay.
And it could mean that your friends will let you down because that's part of the fallen nature and where we are.
Yeah.
And I think that, not that you're looking and expecting everybody to fail you,
Right.
but don't be surprised
Yeah.
because they might.
Right.
Good chance
Yeah.
that you're going to have friends that fail you. And then what? And if it's, I can't believe this, just like the broken shoelace, then there's a sense of, what in the world's going on versus we're in a fallen world,
Right.
but he's overcome the world and it's a long story and I'm going to look forward with hope.
Yeah.
Am I speaking your language
Yeah.
here?
Yeah, you're reminding me of LaRusso. We started with him, and one of the things he wrote about is that all human action is undertaken in hope. That's interesting. Every single thing we do is undertaken in hope that it's going to be something worth doing, that I'm going to have some effect. I mean, in the book, one of the ways I put it is that every conversation is an invitation to reframe. Please see the world my way. So every time I speak, I'm saying, what do you think about this? I mean, I hope that you'll see my point of view. So the old Roman line is where there's life, there's hope. If there's no hope, none at all, that's when you end your life. So if you're still doing anything at all, there is still some measure of hope. And it certainly relates to how we speak.
Dwelling within ourselves. Talk about that.
Well, this one, I argue that we ought to dwell within in peace. When I do my own writing, I can kind of rank what I'm arguing, how well I'm doing with that myself. So I could look at each of these soul essentials and say, I think this is my strongest one and this is my weakest one. So this is my weakest one because the framework, so the continuum that we work back and forth on, I think, when we're dealing with ourselves is perfectionism to grace. Perfectionism to grace, which is just another way of saying works to grace, law to grace. But the new word is perfectionism. So where we are on that continuum has everything to do with whether or not we're going to be able to frame ourselves in peace. So if I'm constantly on the perfectionist side, I'm going to be talking about myself, whether I measure up, whether my achievements are what I'm about. I've often thought that I could start my own kind of AA, which would be Achieveaholics Anonymous or Accomplishaholics Anonymous. Hi, I'm Greg Spencer. I'm an accomplishaholic. So, I got to have my list. I got to check off my list. I got to get it all done. And
then if you do, it wasn't long enough.
the list wasn't long enough, right?
Right.
So that's at the heart of, a struggle with some of the key issues related to peace, which I think have to do with humility and contentment. So as I think about what I've written, these are more struggle areas for me. And I think it's one of the reasons why I was originally attracted to faith, because I saw how trapped I was in my own perfectionism. And I need to be told the story of grace, I think, every day.
We named not one of our children, but two with the name of Grace.
Yeah.
We want to remind ourselves, first
Right.
name and a middle name.
Right.
Engaging others with love.
One of the ways that I talk about issues in this area has to do with the way that we relate. So engaging with others in love, how do we do that? In our culture, there's a lot of things we do to avoid each other. And I think that, people ask me, so what's the biggest change you observed in students in the last 30 years? That is such an easy question. There is no hesitation. It's cell phones. Nothing has changed life on campus, life interacting between students. I used to say Westmont's the friendliest campus that I've ever been around. It's no longer, because people have their earbuds in. People are looking on their phones. 1 out of 4 will, not 1 out of 4, 1 out of 10 will say hello. They're just in their own world. So one of the ways I talk about this for culture is that I say that time is up and space is down. And what I mean by that is the values that we associate with time, such as speediness and urgency and efficiency, those are time-driven values. Well, those are up. So if I text you and you don't text me back in whatever X amount of time, you're immoral. It's now at the level of ethics.
Right.
I mean, you're a bad person if you don't respond quickly. If you don't like my Instagram post, there's something, what's the matter with you? I mean, and people feel this tremendous relational anxiety over this. So time is up, and this is affecting the way we love each other. And I think space is down, which is what happens when we're in each other's presence. So we're normally interrupting that presence with our cell phones by, oh yeah, we're in the middle of an important conversation, but fine, I'll just check my text and roll over here and ignore you for a little bit, do whatever I need to do. When I see people at lunch on campus, or you go to any restaurant, lots of people are not having conversations. I'm always noting with sadness, here's this couple that's out for dinner and we're right next to them and they haven't spoken. They haven't spoken. Well, either they're on their phones or sometimes they just have nothing to say. So part of that I think is down is hospitality, private hospitality and public hospitality. And the phones have seriously affected the way we interact with one another in each other's presence. So part of that is traditional hospitality, inviting people over, getting in conversation, being present when you're with them. But I think what's taken a real serious hit is public hospitality. So you're in line at Starbucks. I mean, can you just even imagine turning to the person next to you and saying, hey, how you doing? Right. Hey, you see that over there? Or just striking up a conversation. It's very difficult because almost everybody's on their phone.
Right.
So I think this technology, for all of its wonders and advantages, it's something that we have to really face if we're going to engage with others in love.
That was one of my questions. What do you tell your kids about technology? And, how would you advise young parents to combat, so that they know how to relate and have conversations and to combat this kind of trend towards, it's really isolation. I mean, we with text and everything else, you pretty much can go without seeing or talking to the person.
Right. So Sherry Turkle, sociologist at MIT, has written a terrific book called Recovering or Regaining, Recovering Conversation, Regaining Conversation. So she wants to not just criticize technology, she wants to somehow help us recover conversation. So one of the things I would say to parents is you need to be involved and be proactive around the dinner table. First of all, make the dinner table count. So your kids need to be there as often as they can. Yeah, people have other activities, but you need to figure out a time to make sure you have some good, solid dinner table time. And then you need to be in charge of that conversation at least some of the time. One of my regrets is looking back on my raising our 3 girls when they were teenagers is we would pray before the meal in Jesus' name, amen. And all 3 girls would start talking at once, and it would just go on and on and on. And, I would feel like I have to take a number if I want to talk. Dad's over here, hey, could I get a word in? And it was great to invite them into that conversation, to let them know that this was a safe space to talk. But I think parents need to say, okay, one night a week, we're in charge. We're in charge. And here's a topic, and here's what we're going to talk about. And we're going to reward you for good conversational skills, like asking questions and being polite. So a couple of times, here's a kind of funny thing that I did. So before dinner, I gave all of our girls some coins, okay, just some money. And I said, no, okay, so I've just put some money there by you, but, whose money is this? It's ours. No, whose money is this? It's yours. Right. Okay, so this is my money. I'm giving you this money, and I'm telling you that whatever money you've got left next to you after dinner, it's yours. So how do you get money? Well, every time that you ask your sister a question, or you say please, or you say thank you, or you engage any of us, I'm going to give you money. Every time you interrupt, every time you take attention and put it on yourself, every time you object to me taking money, I will take money. And one of my daughters said, yeah, but, and I took a coin. No, but, and then I took another coin. Okay, I get the picture. But just playing a game to try to say, we need to learn how to have conversation. We don't know how to do it.
I thought this was a really interesting, page 162 and 63. You talk about moving from, or suggesting moving from I am statements. And you say nothing remains exactly the same, not rocks, not nations, not me. Everything is dynamic in process. And you say God's the only I am. When we say I am this or that, it can be defining in a way that's actually not best. And I wonder if you'd talk about that. I've thought about that idea before, especially in, even in recovery kind of communities. I am an addict. Right. I am, and I think there can be a defining element to that statement. I mean, I understand what they're doing, but I'm saying I was fascinated by this idea and wondered if you'd talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. A couple of the ways that we do that in really destructive terms, we'll say, I am a failure. We might also be destructive when we say, I am a success. It could be positive, but it's static. There's a phrase that from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus I throw out in one of my classes. It's whatever is ising. And what he means is that whatever exists is in dynamic process. It's ising. So you is. If you is ising, because you're not ever the same. And that's great to remember. So the Dean Wilson that I meet here is not the Dean Wilson of 20 years ago or even 2 weeks ago. Yeah, exactly. We're all grateful. But
we're all grateful.
It's ways we can think about ourselves too, right? So I know I'm in process, and I may feel like a failure today, but I'm failuring today, but I might be doing something else tomorrow. So it just struck me, this phrase in the Old Testament, that God refers to himself as I am who I am. That is so fascinating. How come God calls himself I am? Well, maybe he's the only being that can do that, because he's not changing. But I am and you are, and that also gives us hope. Just a little footnote on this. One of the books I read for my book was called Your Body Believes Every Word You Say. And in it, the author talks about disease and not using it is or noun language. So she says, don't say I have cancer, because that sounds like it's static. You say, I am cancering. I'm cancering. Whatever's happening to our bodies is not just something that thud. It's there and nothing can be done. It's always in process. So if we can use verbs in relationship to ourselves as well as in relation to what's happening to our bodies, that's a good thing.
That's very interesting. On page 90, you talk about good forgetting. You talk about that remembering has its benefits, and we're running short on time. It's flying by. But talk for just a moment about, you said remembering has its benefits, but so does forgetting. But like trying to fall asleep at night, the harder you try, the more you don't fall asleep.
Right.
Talk about good forgetting and that thought.
Right. Yeah. So we probably all remember times that we have forgotten. So we might, my example might be, somebody says, hey, tell me about your vacation. So I start talking about my vacation and how wonderful it was, and I was in Switzerland, and we walked here and we walked there, and it was really incredible. And then somebody says, you know, you had really bad blisters that day, and you actually couldn't go on a hike, and I had forgotten the blisters. And so it's kind of a simple example, but there are lots of times that we deal with our past when we've actually forgotten something that was troubling or harmful to us, and it's a joy to have forgotten that. Maybe I had a terrible blowout with a colleague, and I mean, I've had this experience where 2 years later someone says, I remember that argument you had with so-and-so, and I actually don't. Could you remind? Oh yeah, I guess I had that. And I think that's something that's about forgiveness. I mean, forgiveness doesn't ensure that we'll forget, but I think the more that we are working toward forgiveness, it actually can get into our memory, and we just aren't dwelling there. We're not in that bitterness, and so it actually kind of passes. That's a good kind of forgetting.
We only have a few minutes left, but I do want to circle back to your dad and kind of how the end of his life. And you mentioned that the best times in terms of your relationship were the last 10 years. But talk a little bit about, you know, I've read the story, by the way, of you going to the house with the guy with the gun. And
right. The wildest weekend of my life.
That was very fascinating.
Yeah.
But so he came. He was 92 at that time, right?
Yeah.
And that's when he came here.
Right.
And so then you ended up having those last three with him here,
Right.
I guess. So just talk about kind of the end of his life and healing and maybe your mom or whatever you think.
Yeah. So a couple things. I'll talk a little bit about my dad, but if there's time, if we can squeeze in, I'd actually like to read a poem that's in the book that's related to this. So maybe I'll do that first and then go to the poem. So my dad, I think that as we began to have a better relationship, part of that had to do with my being more welcoming to him because I'd forgiven him. But part of it had to do with him. His last marriage, my mom died of cirrhosis, he remarried, and he remarried a woman that was much stronger than my mom. And my dad really struggled with that, and it humbled him. I thought for a long time that my mom had created the most narcissistic person I'd ever met, my father, because she just submitted to everything he wanted to do. And now he had a woman who didn't do that. And that was a real struggle for him. So here he is in his 90s calling me, asking me for marital advice. So I think the way in which you can see a kind of pattern here. So I'm able to welcome him because I'm forgiving him, because I've reframed. He feels safer now to be humble. And in that, our relationship becomes much more intimate, I think, and just caring for each other as two men. Even though there are limits to what we were able to do, but it was a wonderful transformation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Share the poem.
Yeah. So I, in the book, there are 17 of my own poems. I end each chapter with a poem. And this poem is about the first time that as a family of the three of us kids, my dad drove drunk, and we began to know what we were in for. But the poem also has its own reframing, so I like what it does as a kind of introduction to the idea. It's called The Beginning of the Road of Ice. Remember the time when we first knew? On that sloppy, wide-eyed ride, the three of us kids in the back seat, no seat belts to keep us tight and safe. We grabbed the front seat, remember? Leaning in, leaning hard. We held on as Dad jerked the car this way and that around one blind turn, and then blinder still on that snake night road. "Why are you driving so fast?" we screamed. "We can go faster in the dark," he said, "'cause you can see the other guy's headlights coming." But the thing is, we didn't see it coming. This drive, this beginning of the road of ice and bourbon, and night after night of near misses and hits. Now we know. But remember this too. We didn't crash that night. Though we've had our accidents, our mangled frames and body work, we made it home. That's what we did. We made it home.
Wow.
So in a way, that's a message to my siblings, as well as other readers that, yeah, we're okay.
That's beautiful. Well, I want to say you've impacted thousands of college students like me, and then lots more with your books. But you're really a special guy to us, to me, to my brother. So thanks for coming down here. The book is Reframing the Soul. I commend it to you. And Greg Spencer, thank you.
Well, thanks, Dean, for inviting me. It was great just to have a good conversation with you.
We may have to do this again.
Yeah, it'd be good.
So thanks for watching The Good Life. We'll see you next time.